I want to take you back 35 years ago when I was a little boy growing up in South Central Los Angeles, who came from a family where education wasn't valued. I came from a family where it was broken. I came from a single-parent home. My father left when I was very young. My mother raised my sister and I. And something always disturbed me as a little boy. And I couldn't understand the difference between the have and the have-nots and why we lived a certain lifestyle. It wasn't until later in life when I began to understand value systems. Poverty, which is a way of life, is a condition of a people or individual's mindset. And when I was in school, they always told me that I was a problem. And I began to view the world as a problem with blinders on. In my house, I watched my mother come home many a nights from her 2 jobs, frustrated, and drank herself to sleep at night. Well, my sister had to cook for me and her. I grew up in a house to where we never sat at the dinner table, and my mother stimulated my mind or engaged me or asked me, what did I want to be in life when I grew up? How was I doing in school? My mother never came to the school because she worked all the time. I grew up as a little boy who went to the refrigerator in the morning, in the afternoon. And you know how sometimes you're at home and you haven't went grocery shopping and you keep going to the refrigerator, but subconsciously you know there's nothing in there to eat? Well, that's what I used to do. We never woke up in the morning and had choices for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. We didn't have the fancy double-door refrigerator. It was sometimes we had grits with a couple strips of bacon that my sister broke up and put in there, maybe a little bit of butter to create a meal. We never had a fruit bowl in the middle of our table. Never. We never had a cookie jar. It was my grandmother who was the only person in my family that had a cookie jar. So I would get up in the morning and I would go to school, not with a vision, not with purpose, not on a mission, but I went to school for everything other than education. I went to school to get multiple lunches. I used to hustle those free lunch tickets they used to give you and get extra apples. And it wasn't this Granny Smith. It actually was those nasty red apples that you can't swallow the skin. I always have an apple when I go out because fruit is important to me. Just imagine children without fruit. Children without a choice in the morning for food to eat. That's what it was like for me. And then I was on the busing program, and I would get on the bus and head to school, and the bus would take us to the suburbs. And I'm looking out of the window, and I see these big, beautiful homes. Mother and fathers coming out, taking their children to school, hugging them, kissing them, congratulating them. The dream I always had was one day to get a house on a hill with a white picket fence, on a quiet street, free of gunshots, big trees, swimming pool in the backyard, and one of those fancy double-door refrigerators, filled with food, filled with choices, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. The career of choice became almost guaranteed for me as a young teenager, as for many young people in many communities across this country. It was drugs, marijuana, eventually cocaine. The role models in the neighborhood became the older homeboys who were manufacturing dreams on street corners, who taught myself and many young people, a whole generation of young people, how to eat better, how to put money in our pockets, how to live the American dream that we thought was American dream. And I embarked on a career of selling drugs, something that I'm not proud of because generations of young people have got caught up in that lifestyle and has impacted them, which has impacted our schools, which have impacted the communities, which have brought 2.5 million people in the penal system, why we have the challenge that we have today. I was blessed in 1988 when I was indicted by the federal government and sent to prison, where I spent nearly 10 years of my life when I was 23 years of age. When I tell my story, I talk about how prison saved my life, how I grew up in prison. I learned how to shave with a razor in prison. I read my first book in prison. I began to embrace education in prison. But it wasn't right away, because I was still caught up in a mindset that didn't allow me to have the values to value and see the payoff in education. Until one day, a Wall Street business mogul, Ivan Boesky, who was a co-defendant of Michael Milken in 1992, who told me, he says, "Henderson, you're a smart guy." I said, "What do you mean?" He says, "When you was on the streets selling drugs," I'm going to get a little chuckles here for this one, "you understood marketing." Yes. Go ahead. "You understood branding. You knew what a bottom line was. You knew how to manage a diverse workforce." That's what he told me. And I said, "Really?" I said, "How did you do that?" "Well, you moved amongst gang members. You said you never had a fight, you never carried guns, you were never violent, but you became a millionaire when you were 19 years old. It takes a smart person to do that." He says, "All you have to do is change the product and get integrity, and there's no stopping you." That never left my mind. I joined Toastmasters in prison, became Sergeant of Arms. I improved my speaking skills. I became more articulate from reading books, taking marketing classes, went and earned my GED. I read this newspaper along with the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, LA Times, New York Times every day, because it was here where I began to value my reading and to realize that I could be more than a drug dealer, and that the blinders can come off and I can really see the world through a different set of eyes. That was a beginning for me of change. Change was a journey. It didn't come easy. You're looking at 20 years of redefining me, of building a brand, 10 years in prison of falling in love with myself and building my self-esteem up, and finding out what is it that I wanted to be when I got out. So here in prison, and I want to put a lot of emphasis on prison, but this is where I got introduced to trades, where I got introduced to careers. And they taught plumbing, electrical, auto mechanic, machinists, painters, sewing, all these different type of trades they had in prison. And, you know, somebody introduced me to the construction foreman, and I took a class on drywall. I took a class on painting. I took a class on plumbing, and I began to learn and become self-taught. And I said, wow, you know, it's fun to learn. I learned how to use my brain and how to think and do these different things. And I was working at the time on a Cadillac crew where I swept cigarette butts. Now, everybody in prison has to have a job. You can't not work unless you're just medically dysfunctional. And I was on a Cadillac crew with all of the Wall Street white-collar criminals, you know, all the Ivan Boeskys, the stockbrokers, the lawyers who swept cigarette butts up for, and CEOs of corporations as well, too. Yes. They had a little too much information, but anyway. I was on this job for 20 minutes a day. I had a little area on the north yard I had to clean, and I didn't go a couple of times, and the lieutenant called me to the office. And can you believe it? They fired me on my job in prison. Yes. I got fired on my job, and they put me in the kitchen on pots and pan detail.